with this crazy Spanish horror movie rec style camera work as I set this up again. And apologies as well, folks, to everybody who might struggle to find this link after the wrong link was posted earlier. Okay, let's have a look, see what we can do here. Okay. Hello, yep. And yep. Hello, everyone. I hope you are able to join me in just a moment. And apologies as well for some of the problems we have had. I'm literally setting up everything again, and it was, you know, something of a kind of technical disaster that we had earlier, but hopefully we are almost back in. To do the same. I was like, no, it's all working. Now it's, oh God, no, it's not. Literally like editing posts as you go. Here we go. Don't. So we have someone joining us already. Hello there, welcome. Well done for finding us, despite the technical difficulties. Yep, there we are. So basically, you know, running live streams on your phone is not always the best idea, but today managed to be a particularly bad idea. Right, here we go. However, we're nearly there, nearly back in action. And oh, just about. So today we are going to be having a little chat about horror movies, which I'm looking forward to. It's always a favourite topic of mine. And we will get started in just a moment. As I mentioned before, we had a little bit of technical difficulty, so we're just fixing that first. To make sure that everyone can join us, because basically the wrong link got posted, which is never good when you're trying to, you know, let folks know where the heck you are. Okay. Say we're about ready. Getting a few messages, notifications saying, hey, the link isn't working, Laurie. It's like, I know, I'm sorry. Okay. Here we are. We have 3 victims now joining us. Greetings, victims. I mean, listeners. Hello and welcome. And feel free to say hello and to introduce yourselves on the chat as well. I'd love to see who is with us today. I think that's about right. Okay. And I will now put this on live chat. So, hello. And who do we have with us today? Let me know in the chats below. Hello everyone. Just typing in a little apology for anyone that had technical difficulties joining me today. Hello everyone. Apologies for any technical issues you had finding us here. Right, and I think we can get started. With the history of horror and independent films. Oh, goody. Link fixed. Live now. So, how many of us here, I wonder, are horror filmmakers or horror fans? Interesting. I think this might be a curious theme during the course of our little chat today, as we look at the subject of the history of horror films and independent filmmaking as well. To aid us on this epic journey that we will share together, I have some cola, which is always good. Unfortunately, there's no bourbon in this cola, which is very sad. I unfortunately drank all the bourbon yesterday. Never mind. As you will know, I am a horror filmmaker. I have directed several horror films: Lord of Tears, The Unkindness of Ravens, The Black Gloves, The Devil's Machine, and some might argue Whiteout, and any of my adolescent home sex videos would certainly count as horror, and comedy as well, in fact. So, as you can probably imagine, I'm fairly experienced in this realm. At the moment, we are producing our very first horror fantasy film, Dragon Knight, and I suppose you could say this video is a little bit like a kind of marathon fundraiser, really, to try and raise that project's profile as well, because it's very cool to be doing our first horror fantasy film, and we look forward to it becoming hopefully a kind of franchise, a trilogy at least, one that we've developed a really cool story for that follows the course of a war in this dark horror fantasy setting in a clash of civilizations. So we're not making things easy for ourselves, we have an epic storyline there. And if you would like to support that project or check it out, or watch the trailer for the movie, then you can do so on the Kickstarter link. And I will now post that link here on the chat. So, we're about to move on to our ambitious little conversation about the history of horror movies. That should be easy. When we consider the history of horror, I think in most folks' minds, we think of the films produced in Germany in the Weimar kind of Republic era. Hi, Justin. Justin Hayward just commented and told us that he has pledged for our campaign. Justin Hayward being a horror film actor as well as a very good British actor in general, who appeared recently in a horror film called The Lockdown Hauntings, which also featured Megan Tremethick as well, who is one of our stars in Dragon Knight, our first of the horror fantasy films. So, we first think of horror in most people's imaginations. This is probably the image of Nosferatu, the vampire from the German expressionistic horror film. And hello there, Metal Maskoff says, hey mate, and likewise, greetings, my friend, to this unusual realm. So, we have German expressionism. Films such as Nosferatu and the This cabinet is Dr. Caligari, or the cabinet of Dr. Caligari as well. Directed by Robert Twines. It would be interesting, any of you folks, and thank you, Metal Mask, of complimenting my evening suit for this very respectable occasion. I would be interested in any of you who are horror fans for your opinion. When you think of the earliest era of horror films, is it the films of Germany that come to mind? Is it The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, or Nosferatu, or Faust, for example, that come to mind? I think, for me personally, it may well be. It's hard to imagine the idea of what the very first horror films look like in our imagination. You know, for me, that goes beyond the memorable sight of Max Schreck as the Nosferatu. I even remember as well reading books on the history of horror, which were things I was always interested in, and as a child, and looking at these harsh black and white photographs of the Nosferatu, or Der Golem as well, the kind of precursor to Frankenstein in some ways, in cinema at least. So, if we go a little bit further back in history, if we want to be technical about things, then one might argue that horror in some ways were visualized by very short films, experimental films. For example, in 1910, Edison Studios produced the first adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in the form of, a short film, I think, if I'm right. We also have films such as Dr. Jekyll and Hyde, 1913, as well. These are silent era films, and before then we have, I guess you could call them like trick films, you know, the kind of films made by Georges Méliès, such as, you know, the Trip to the Moon, except of the more macabre skeletal variety, things like that. Was the first feature film to really capture the imagination in the realm of horror the works of, you know, Germany? Was that the case? I don't know. What do you guys think? Let me know in the chats below. If we consider some of the films made between 1910 and 1916, we have some interesting ones to look at. So classic literature was the first source of adaptation. For example, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and even Dante's Inferno as well. The Divine Comedy, you know, provided inspirations, things from mythology, you know, visualizing the 9 circles of hell and things like that. Faust as well being an interesting theme, and of course anything with the devil as well. And I think prior to German Expressionism, these films had an almost kind of medieval character about them in the way that they visualized evil. You know, the influence felt a lot closer to religious sources, you know? No one is in a rush to make Faust, for example, now, you know, the pact with the devil, in quite the same way and in the same atmosphere that, you know, films did early on. We have a question here from Metal Maskov. What do I think? I think Owlman should come back. Haha, legend. So, Metal Maskov, let me ask you, are you referring to Owlman from the horror films, or are you talking in reference to the Owlman in our previous videos, which were produced to promote the films that Owlman were in, but had a life of their own? And those were the videos in which our poor victims were stalked and terrified by the Owlman in a series of prank videos, which, having something of a very macabre sense of humour, is something I have been guilty of enjoying perhaps a little too much. Yes, the Owlman prank videos. So let's segue a little bit from our history, since we do have all evening together to chat about this. The Owlman prank videos, they actually take some inspiration from German Expressionism as well, like horror films from the 1920s in Germany. The idea of this dark stalker standing there like Nosferatu, creeping on his unwary prey. In our prank videos, these were often folks that we would call to our location with everything ready for them. At first, we used to film at a very popular site for urban exploration, and then that became a little too difficult because people were too familiar with our presence there. So instead, we started luring them to different locations with some success, actually. But nothing quite captured the imagination for fans of the Owlman, like the ruined hospital, the very first location we filmed there. And that place was where our most successful prank videos were. But on a more sad note, you will notice that right now, you cannot really see any of the Owlman prank videos on YouTube. There might be a few that are up that some people have just re-uploaded, but they've actually been taken down. The whole channel got destroyed by YouTube and its new rules for community guidelines. So we were lucky in that we were able to sell the main YouTube channel that had a lot of subscribers for the Owlman pranks before that happened. And they had deleted the Owlman content, so they just used the channel and the subs for whatever they wanted to do. But unfortunately, it did mean that the Owlman videos got taken down, and whenever they were re-uploaded, they often get taken down. So I will have to think of a new home for the Owlman prank videos, just so we can preserve the legacy of those amusing and very creepy pranks. We just have someone saying hello there. General Kratos, or Kratos, greetings to you, sir, and welcome to the channel and to our discussion about the history of horror. Also, for anyone watching, please feel free to ask any questions or to make any points you would like to talk about in respects to the history of horror. At the moment, we've been talking a little bit about the adaptations of early literary works and novels from 1910 to 1920, and then from the 1920s, in which we see the rise of German Expressionism. Expressionism being an art form in which we externalize the visual representation of inner meanings. For example, we might have a character who is going insane perform in a set that is designed in a manner to look insane, with angles, shapes, and all kinds of unusual things like that. Visualizing it externally, you know. Metal Maskov says, thank you for the insight on the Owlman, and thanks. Great to see you again, sir, and have a lovely evening, my friend. And thank you, Metal Maskov, as well. It's always a pleasure to meet fans of the Owlman, a character that's very close to our hearts. And General Kratos says, I look like the WF wrestler, The Undertaker, which is very cool because being a child of the 80s and early 90s, The Undertaker was my favourite wrestler. And I am glad that you say I look like him rather than his one-time manager, Paul Berry? Was that his name? So let's have a look at some films from German Expressionism then. So of course we have Nosferatu, and we have The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, an unusual story in which a man is brought to life in a very notable and terrifying scene, the way he opens his eyes as well. Performed by the actor Caesar Conrad Veidt as well. Thank you, Leon Carrington, a friend of mine from my hometown in Dysart, reminds us all that the manager for The Undertaker was Paul Bearer as well, which is important and appreciated, and as is the fact that I definitely do not look like him, but instead look like The Undertaker, who is, I think, the most formidable of all the WF wrestlers. And The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari was directed by Robert Wine. And Faust, and I should remember this, and I do apologise for not. The director of Faust, of course, being one of the most famous German directors, if not the most famous German director of that era, F.W. Murnau, who of course directed Nosferatu as well, and pretty good, really, eh? Yeah, to have those two in your books. Justin Hayward, British actor, remarks that it's a shame we are not drinking rosé in Cannes at the moment in time, but I guess red wine will have to do for now, so of course I'm sure you have red wine. At home, Justin, I have only cola, unfortunately, and true enough, as industry professionals, me and Justin would in fact ordinarily be in Cannes at the moment enjoying the cheapest beverages on sale at one of the richest and most glamorous locations in the world. But instead, I'm here with all of you bastards. Never mind, who needs Cannes, right? When we can be discussing the history of horror. So, German Expressionism. This would eventually evolve to influence things such as film noir as well, the kind of gangster films from the 30s, from 40s, and all kinds of stuff, including as well Fritz Lang as well, the director of M, the story of a serial killing paedophile played by Peter Lorre, in one of the most memorable and very disturbing films of that era. We also have Waxworks, which is a film that has been made and remade a few times as well, made in this time, which is also quite exceptional, directed by Paul Lenny. During this time in Germany, it's not like folks in Britain or America were doing nothing, regarding horror. It's just that at the time, the idea of horror as a genre on itself was perhaps, at least in film, less defined. And one might argue this with me, and I'm happy to stand corrected or sit corrected on this point. But horror was, at the time, perhaps more something linked to a story. Like would you like a scary story? Not, here is a story from a genre known as scary stories, i.e. horror, But this would start to form during the course of the 1920s. The horror in the US of A wouldn't begin to get used to describe a genre of films until it is roughly estimated the early 1930s. I think in Germany, though, in the 1920s, we can agree that with there being so many horror films, so stylized and expressionistic, and how creepy they wanted to be, that they had a much stronger sense of horror as a genre as well. In the early 1930s, American films focused on traditional ideas of horror inspired by literature as well. And you can probably imagine what that might be. Gothic being, for example, one of them. Dark melodramas, emotion-laden plots with romance, suspense, and even a little sentimentality. Authors such as Victor Hugo and Edgar Allan Poe feature prominently. And not as yet authors such as H.P. Lovecraft, who at that time was still a very unrecognized author, mostly published in, well, comics really, or well, maybe not comics, but like magazines, for example, such as Weird Tales. Eventually, though, from Universal Pictures, we would get the so-called Universal Classic Monsters. We would get our Quasimodos, the Hunchback of Notre Dame, and characters made popular by actors such as Lon Chaney as well, who was the superstar of that time, and he would play a character. Let's see if there's any horror fans that can correct me on, or remind me, should I say. But Lon Chaney would play a character, I think, that would form the inspiration for the Joker in Batman. The man with the smile or something like that. Can anyone remember who that was? What that character was? The man who couldn't smile, or the man, or... let's find out. Lon Chaney. Joker, the man who laughs. That's right. So, brilliant character actor, great horror villain, widely celebrated. And if you check, if you type in Google image search for the man who laughs, you will see a very strong visual of Lon Chaney dressed as such. A character that is very reminiscent of the Joker, and perhaps may well have been the very best Joker had he, how could he live to 200 years old? I think he would have given folks a very strong run for their money. And Geek Shall Inherit the Earth says that was Conrad Veidt. Have I made a mistake there then? Oh, right, again, thank you, Geek. You see, honestly, you're right. So, The Man Who Laughs is a German expressionist film directed by Paul Lenny, and it was Conrad Veidt that performed that character as well. Not Lon Chaney. Wah. And so, in fact, Conrad Veidt, the chap who plays the freaky character from The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, is also the man responsible for that Joker character. Poor Lon Chaney, though. That's not to take away the credit from Lon Chaney, who have just bigged up in the wrong direction. So let me tell you a little bit about Lon Chaney and why he is so noted. Lon Chaney famously played the Phantom of the Opera, and also is famous for, see if I can find a link for you as well for this. Transformation. Just want to get this right, in case it's another German actor that I'm about to miscredit. That would be bad. Okay, right. So, I was about to, I think, credit again somebody else. Poor Lon Chaney. I'm so sorry, Lon Chaney. Giving him a hard time. let's give Lon Chaney some love. He was the biggest American silent era horror actor. For those of you who are fans of Lon Chaney, throw up in the chat what you loved about him. Just some of the, I mean, famously playing Quasimodo being one of them, and the Phantom of the Opera as well. Brilliant actor. And his son as well performed in horror as well. And they were something of a kind of a horror family, really, kind of celebrated horror family. So, we'll go back to the US then. And yep, Hunchback of Notre Dame 1923 and 1925 Phantom of the Opera starring Lon Chaney are two great American horror films worth checking from the earliest era. Excellent. So we have a comment from Brooke H. It's always a pleasure to see you there, Brooke, as well. And big hugs and greetings to you. Brooke says, Lon Chaney's use of body language to convey emotion, given the makeup that he wore, which was especially thick during the 1920s, was fantastic. Lon Chaney basically had a face that was, to put too fine a point on it, very elastic, and as such he was able to create remarkable and very disturbing expressions, and he was fully committed to the physicality of his performances, bringing what you could almost say to be a very extreme physical theatre-esque performance to his characters, which, you know, is exactly what we want from our villains. You know, one need only consider, for example, Stephen King's It and his little clown dance to get an idea of how important physicality is. Okay, so we have in 1927 a horror film, The Unknown, that Lon Chaney was in, directed by Todd Burning. Todd Burning being the very controversial director of the horror film Freaks, as it was called, which is an interesting film worth discussing for a moment. But let's just check the year that Freaks was made. Was it 1928 or 1929? Freaks. 1932. Well, we'll jump forward a little bit into 1932, even though we're still more or less in the 1920s here. So, Todd Burning directs in 1932 the film Freaks. I would ask, Brooke remarks that Freaks is possibly one of the most disturbing films because of its casting and reality. And this was also the reason for the film's great controversy upon release and in the years afterwards. And it's interesting because in some respects the film has been reappraised, condemned, then reappraised again. It's a very curious thing. I would be interested on all of your opinions, for those of you who have seen Freaks, regarding the ethics of the film and its casting and production. So you might wonder, if you haven't seen Freaks, to what I refer, and it is quite simply this. Freaks is a story about a seductress who attempts to trick somebody out of their fortune who runs a circus. This person being a little person, and just when they seem like they'll get away with it, and that seductress or villain is hunted down by the freaks, as they are titled from the film, and these consist of people with all sorts of physical disabilities, you could call them, mental issues, missing limbs, all these kinds of things. And they consisted of several of the most famous sideshow stars of the day, such as so-called Prince Randian, known as the Living Torso, a man with no arms or legs who wriggled about like a worm. Although from his strength and dexterity was anything other, than a worm. So you can imagine this assembly of characters in the climactic scene of this film, where they're pursuing this villain in the midst of a storm, it being very haunting and disturbing. But of course, the ethical argument that was made at the time was that it was seen as reprehensible because it was exploiting the disabilities or the physical or mental conditions of the characters that play the freaks, inverted commas. Was that cruel, perverse, or on the other hand, the other interpretation or argument is these are performers, and they utilized their physical conditions to perform unique and impossible to match performances by those with different bodies to themselves. One might say normal, but like that wouldn't, however we wish to justify or classify that, and that and it was empowering for them to be able to make money with that. So those are the two arguments, and depending on which moral perspective gained favour at any one time, the film freaks would be condemned or defended, And I think at the moment, I'm not quite sure where the ethical sword of Damocles hangs over the fate of that film. Similar complaints were made about the horror film The Sentinel as well, for actors that were used in that, or performers, or just people with disabilities or disfigurements, to portray demons and victims of hell. Personally, my own perspective is one that I think any moral perspective that takes away a person's independent freedom to decide whether or not they wish to participate in a work of art is a form of moral paternalism. It suggests that person knows better than the participant whether or not they should be in such a film. And when we consider as well that there are several YouTubers who are very successful at utilizing their unique experiences of life based on physical or mental conditions that they have, that is also acceptable now as well, then I think in retrospect it is perhaps not our place to decide whether others should be allowed, to play a badass demon or a crazy murderous circus performer. I certainly know that if I had no arms or legs, that I would probably want to be, and I wanted to act, that I would certainly not want someone to say I wasn't of sound mind to be able to, or that I would just be exploited if I was ever in front of the camera for my condition. So Sleeping Collectibles says, hey everyone, and allow me to welcome you, Sleeping Collectibles, to Channel Hex. Hope you enjoy your stay, and I hope you subscribe and hang out with us more. And I've just had one downvote from someone that has privately messaged me to say that they are very offended at the idea that people should enjoy a film such as Freaks because of the way it abused its cast. So there you go. It gives you an example of how strong people's feelings are on the issue. Book says it's definitely considered an exploitation film still, which is true, and and Brooke, correct me if I'm wrong, Brooke, because I don't want to misrepresent your position. You said the protagonist was considered a progressive move, in which I think what you're saying is the protagonist, of course, being those folks with disabilities, was considered progressive because they had a chance to play important characters in the story, and that they weren't just like, for example, just secondary characters there for the ridicule or fear or whatever of protagonists that were supposedly, you know, perfect physical forms. Cool, and yes, and thank you, Brooke. So let's consider that for a second. 1932, Todd Burning has made a film that is controversial, interesting work of art that people could love or loathe, and still has people talking about it almost 90 years later, you know? How many A24 films, for all their pretentiousness, will be talked about in 90 years' time? Yeah? Yeah? I'm only joking. Don't go down voting me just because of the A24 jokes, because there will be at least 2 more jokes like that to be made during this video chat. So, we're in the 1920s. And we jumped briefly to 1932 for Todd Burning Freaks, but of course Todd Burning also did other films as well. The Unholy 3 in 1925, which he remade in 1930 as a talkie. The Unholy 3 is not a film that I've seen before, but again, it also used actors as well, who had worked in the sideshow, so-called sideshow industry. We have in America films with Mad Doctors and of course Frankenstein as well. Cat and the Canary. Interestingly, in 1927, we have the German director Paul Lenny, and a few German directors, including Fritz Lang, would eventually go to live in the United States. Partly because of the persecution of Jews and artists and intellectuals by, you know, Nazi Germany, really. You know, it's easy to forget as well that the march towards Nazism in Germany began long before the start of the Second World War, and that the culture and society of the time and its drift towards that political slant made it increasingly uncomfortable for many, you know, artists. And horror artists are traditionally on the fringe, and traditionally make films that are making comments about society and culture as well, that can very easily fall foul of authoritarian, you know, governments and ideologies. So we have Paul Lenny. He's in the United States, and he directs in 1927 silent horror film The Cat and the Canary. Now, The Cat and the Canary is based on the book by John Willard as well, and this film would also form an inspiration as well for directors such as Alfred Hitchcock as well, who considered it one of his primary influences. The Cat and the Canary would also form a strong foundation to Universal's confidence as a horror film studio as well. To put simply, The Cat and the Canary is a story about a group of people that are called to get the results of a will to someone who's deceased, And during the course of their stay at this mysterious mansion, where they will learn who's inherited the fortune, they begin succumbing one by one to terrible fates. And you will see this again in later films, such as The House on Haunted Hill and things like that as well. It's always a classic trope to get called to the house with a group of people with only one surviving. Paul Lenny's next film was the one that I miscredited to Lon Chaney. The Man Who Laughs as well, whose wonderful antagonist formed the inspiration for the Joker, with Conrad Veidt as well, a wonderful German character actor who was also in the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. So we're seeing a strong infusion of post-First World War Germany into American horror. They're bringing the Gothic and they're bringing elements of Expressionism as well, which are those very extreme macabre themes which go beyond the American pop cultural perspective of the time on horror as something that is like a scary story or something spooky, that it could be much darker and almost perverse, as well as something that influences the genre. And I'm sure played no small part as well for filmmakers such as Todd Burning as well, to feel that they could be more transgressive and push boundaries also. The Last Performance, 1929, is one of the films often credited as being one of the last of the Universal classic monster movies. Is it? I'm not sure. Conrad Veidt stars again, this time as a sinister stage magician. It kind of surprises me that credit linking it to Universal's horror, because in many ways it's more like a really dark psychological drama, mystery kind of chiller. But in any case, sure. It's not to say that it was only Universal producing horror films in the 1920s. We do have others. And what were they, I hear you ask? Well, we have Rex Ingram, the Magician, which contained one of the very first examples of what might be called a mad scientist movie. And in The Magician, I think it starred Ivan Petrovich as the mad doctor. It's kind of interesting how often international actors from Germany or Eastern Europe would perform as the villains in these films. In Todd Burning's cast Lon Chaney in his horror film The Unknown in 1927, we mentioned it earlier, and it involves a knife thrower known as Alonzo the Armless, and an early role of Joan Crawford, a scantily clad girl who he hopes to marry. Joan Crawford, of course, being a big silent era actress who moved into the talkies and would become controversial in many respects because she was accused of abuse by her daughter, adapted into a film that became, and supposedly was supposed to be a serious drama called Mommy Dearest, but unintentionally became a hilarious and very popular cult film, especially among American gay audiences who loved the massively over-the-top drag queen-esque style performance of Joan Crawford by talented actress, remember, Faye Dunaway, yeah. Most famous for the wire coat hangers scene, which is always worth checking on YouTube for some delights and glee. We have Warner Brothers getting involved in horror with The Terror, a first all-talking horror film as well, about a group of guests staying in an old English manor that is being stalked by a mysterious killer known only as the Terror. Not necessarily the most popular film at the time, unfortunately, for critics, but still an interesting technical accomplishment for the time as well. Brooke remarks that Mommy Dearest is a fantastic 80s cult schlock, and I couldn't agree more. In fact, it wouldn't necessarily be an outsider to any horror film marathon if you felt like indulging your friends with an unexpected horror surprise in the form of Faye Dunaway in crazy makeup playing Joan Crawford. If I was Joan Crawford, there are parts of the film I would have found almost complimentary because of how outrageous and hilarious they are. But then I am one for self-deprecative humour. Though one might need a lot of self-deprecative humour for the accusations Mommy Dearest made. We also have a number of European films. For example, The Phantom Carriage in 1921, made in Sweden, Victor Skorstrom. And we also have, let's see, it's interesting actually, I'm looking here, we have various films made in Denmark, Sweden, but we're not seeing many horror films from like Russia, for example. Now, again, my research can only cover so many films, and there will be plenty we're losing. I mean, we could have this chat for 10 hours or 20 hours and we still wouldn't scratch the surface of the history of horror films. There's a Japanese film now that I'm trying to remember, and I'm wondering if it's the 1930s. Folks, see if you can remember which one I might be referring to. It's set in a mental asylum, and it concerns a husband who cannot leave his wife. And at the end, the patients in the asylum gather a collection of masks, like no opera masks, and wear them to chilling effect. And we have a lovely hello from Babette Bombshell as well. Hello, Babette. It's absolutely wonderful to see you here. Babette Bombshell is an actor that one might describe as the Charles Lawton of independent horror films, and collaborates a lot with Trauma as well, which is celebrated and a wonderful horror studio. And I always consider their films an absolute delight. So yeah, see if you can remember what that Japanese film might be, if you can get there before I can. Right. I think it's A Page of Madness, 1926, directed by Tenosuke Kinugasa. The obvious pronunciation of that great director's name. A Page of Madness is quite exquisite, very beautiful, and it pains me a little bit to think of those films, especially outside of Europe and the United States, that will slip by in this chat. But you know, we can always have many more of these chats and about the wonderful history of horror films and what they mean to us as well. But The Page of Madness is almost like an art film in some respects as well. But don't let that put you off. It has chilling moments and shots that do linger in the memory. And for a film produced in that era to have such power, basically 95 years ago, is a huge accomplishment for the artists and technicians that made that production. Interestingly, Italian film, the Monster of Frankenstein, or Il Mostro di Frankenstein, 1921, is now considered lost to history, but was actually one of the only Italian horror films made before, by the late 1950s, apparently. So that's quite striking when we consider just how indelible the influence of Italian horror has been on the genre, that for such a long time, it seems there were no Italian horror productions. And Babette remarks, it's lovely to catch me live, and thank you. Likewise, it's also charming to speak with you live as well, Babette. And also Babette remarks that A Page of Madness has beautiful imagery in that film, and it's always nice to see someone else who appreciates that film, and certainly I suggest you all check it out. Book also adds that he is sorry to say that his knowledge and exposure to early 20th century Asian horror films is minimal, and he'll have to check this out. And yes, I would, I'm similar in that respect as well. I've always really loved Japanese horror as well. And in terms of the new wave, the J-horror new wave was actually back 20 years ago, was one of the inspirations for me to get the confidence to become a horror filmmaker, as a result largely of their minimalist contemporary set ghost stories and the sense of cultural power they had as well, that they weren't an externalized fetishistic perspective of something scary as if it was completely different to our world, but in Japanese culture and Shinto and Buddhist tradition, the idea that such supernatural energies, or however you wish to describe them, might permeate ordinary life in some form, I found to be really interesting and quite inspirational. It made the fantastic sound and feel so much more accessible, and that's something I've always found quite important as a horror writer, filmmaker. So that's great, but it, like yourself, Brooke, didn't mean that I spent enough time checking out the earlier works. A lot of them destroyed, of course, during the Second World War, but of those that survive, their influences stem from Japanese theatre and dance traditions as well. There is an interesting essay written by, I think, Bertolt Brecht, the German playwright. Which actually talks a bit about why Japanese horror was especially unusual and creepy to Western audiences, even when it didn't seek to do so or be so. And I think that's an essay called The Cultural Alienation Effect, where Brecht, I think, talks about his experiences watching Japanese theatre. It's worth checking out. Yeah. I was also just having a quick little look as well. Another essay worth checking out as well is the essay of Sigmund Freud as well, on the nature of the uncanny as well, which also has an interesting connection to Japanese horror as well. Two very interesting and very great thinkers that one might not agree with completely, but whose contributions are fascinating stuff for the artist and for the devotee and fan of horror. So now we arrive at the 1930s. I'm just thinking, I've arrived at the 1930s already. Oh, good. After an hour, that means that we should be spending the next 6 days together then, gentlemen and ladies, I hope, by the time that we actually reach the 1960s. Now would seem like a very good time to very quickly plug the Kickstarter for Dragon Knight, our first horror fantasy film. The link of which is in our video description below. For those of you who have already backed our first horror fantasy film, please accept my most humble thanks as well. Because after all, we are not attempting to be a normal horror studio. We are grassroots, we are horror fans and filmmakers. And our YouTube channel, Channel Hex, and these kinds of conversations are really part of what we want to encourage more of. Because, we want to make horror art with you, not for you. So I'll add the link here again, and then I'm going to go and fetch some more cola. I will be back in just 20 seconds, and then we shall move to the 1930s. Excuse me for just one moment. Right, well, I'm back. Hello, yeah, I've got some more cola now as well, so that's fascinating. If you get a chance, folks, please do feel free to share the link to our chat, because I did attempt to do so earlier today, and then accidentally we made a mistake in the URL. Always a wise move. So please feel free to post. We have some more comments. Babette very kindly compliments our trailer for Dragon Knight, describing it as amazing. Thank you, Babette. Brooke also says they're very excited for Dragon Knight. And Babette remarks that it's awesome to see the locations that we scouted to be used for such brilliant effect. To which I can only assume Babette refers to our Hex Diaries videos, where one of our videos showed us looking for various locations for Dragon Knight. These mostly consisted of me huffing and puffing and struggling to catch up and keep up with my cousin Michael, who's a much thinner man than I, and one with legs that are much longer. And so we now come to the 1930s. In the 1930s, Universal Pictures continued to produce films based on Gothic horror. One can easily say that Universal Pictures entered its golden age during the 1930s. We would see films such as Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, and The Invisible Man all come to fame. The success of those original films would spawn many sequels and were bankable, funding the growth of Universal into a major studio. You could say that in America, it effectively monopolized horror, really. It made stars out of Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff. And let's have a little look at just some of those films. Let's go to Dracula. So we have in 1931, Bela Lugosi, Dracula. I would like to see what you guys think. Directed by Todd Burning, and one might say uncredited by Karl Freund as well. A little bit of controversy on that one. What do you guys think of 1931 Dracula by Universal in comparison to Nosferatu? Which do you prefer? I would be curious to hear that. In any case, at the time, Dracula was a success, and it spawned a foreign version as well, which used the same sets and was produced with a different cast, which is certainly one way to do it, an international dub. Followed very soon by Boris Karloff as Frankenstein, directed by the brilliant English director James Whale. Babette remarks that the Spanish version of Dracula was awesome. I've not seen the Spanish version, so I would be very interested to hear why. What you enjoyed about that. So, okay, so we have also Paramount released Dr. Jekyll Mr Hyde, starring Frederick March, who would go on to win Best Actor. I'm kind of just wondering now if any of you can recall the amazing transformation scene of Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde. I don't think it wasn't the Paramount film. I think it was the one that had John Barrington in it. Can anyone remember which year and what film that was? We have some charming remarks. Brooke says, I think it's a classic in respects to 1931 Dracula, inspired by Stoker's portrayal of a more human Dracula compared to the more monstrous expressionism of Nosferatu. Absolutely, and it certainly is a reason why many might prefer Bela Lugosi's Dracula. Todd E. Walnuts greets me and says, I'm looking sharp, my friend, and thank you, Todd, I very much appreciate it. I thought it was nice to go to special effort for all of you this evening, on this Sunday evening, which for many of you might in fact be early evening or afternoon. Justin Hayward must leave now and bid us all adieu. I shall say goodbye to you, Justin, and wish you well and hope to speak to you soon. I haven't seen Paramount's 1931 Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So, yeah, that's one that I'm going to have to add. But there is bonus points if anyone can remember the... Oh, and I need to check it again. There's a famous transformation scene in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Ah, okay. 1941 American version with Spencer Tracy. I think the scene to which I refer is from 1932, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Ruben Mamoulian for Warner Brothers. So this may well be the one then that I've actually just been referring to. And it used a technique with white, yellow and green lights, I think, even though it was filmed in black and white, to bring out different hues and contrasts in the face, which was combined with the physical performance, which was done very well, to create a kind of almost seemed more like a one-shot transformation that was thought, incredible. And for anyone that would like to see that, you can simply search for 1932 transformation Hyde and you'll see video examples of that. Phil Chadwick, hello there Phil, it's nice to see you here. Phil remarks that the Dracula from that year, the Italian one, was good. Phil, can you remember the name of that film? Which he remarks was one he learned about from Mark Gatiss' History of Horror TV documentary. Brooke mentions the 1941 American version of Jekyll and Hyde with Spencer Tracy. I don't know if I've seen that one either. Babette talks about Todd Burning's Dracula being more stagey because Burning was not used to the huge cameras used, and that the Spanish versions used the cameras in the space much better. I have heard this before, and in this case we're talking about the Bela Lugosi film that was reproduced with Spanish cast for international language versions. And that many folks have remarked that the Spanish one, in fact, had better cinematography. And I think I've seen some side-by-side examples of that as well, using tracking shots and the like. And Phil just confirms that the film he meant was in fact the Spanish version of the 1931 Dracula and not the Italian. So interesting that you both come up with that point. And Book remarks as well about the makeup and the transformation scene in the Jekyll and Hyde that I mentioned being quite remarkable. And Phil says, and this is true, the Spanish version of Dracula was filmed at night in the same sets as the American version was shot in during the day as well, which is quite a remarkable thing to bring in a whole crew and cast to film literally around the clock. But this was how studios made their money. You know, they wasted nothing. They did not want to waste sets. They didn't want to waste props. They kept their props, kept their costumes, kept everything on lots with warehouses, buildings, and filmed the hell out of them until they were literally falling apart. And much respect to them for that determination and entrepreneurialism, because hell, that is the stuff the film industry was built on. And in that respect, it was very much the United States that led the way to making film an industry. And not just an art form, although it is the art form that we all love and cherish especially. Phil remarks, yes, 24-hour filming, rather amazing. Yep, feels a bit like being on one of our Hex shoots. They often unintentionally become 24-hour filming days as well. In 1932, Universal Pictures releases a double feature. The first is The Murders in the Rue Morgue, which also stars Bela Lugosi as a lunatic scientist, kidnaps women, and injects them with blood from an ape. This is not very close adaptation of the story from Edgar Allan Poe, which I can't say I was ever a huge fan of. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this story effectively concerns a giant ape that has escaped and has begun killing people with a razor. Now, the second film is in fact one of my favourite horror films of all time. It's very endearing, it's very funny, as well as it's quite creepy, and it has some wonderful dialogue as well. James Whale, again, fantastic English director of Frankenstein 1931, went on to direct The Old Dark House, which stars Boris Karloff and consists of 5 travellers who end up having to stay the night with a very strange family. The Old Dark House has some fantastic dialogue and performances, where lines such as "have a potato" have a strange and creepy resonance that go far beyond what power the words themselves might suggest. One of the things I really like about The Old Dark House is that it was a film that is comfortable with being just a little bit strange, but isn't especially self-aware to the point of being pretentious about it. You know? Their wink to the audience is there, but it's not grotesquely self-indulgent, as many horror comedies are nowadays. 1932, Universal releases The Mummy, again starring Boris Karloff. It's interesting to think how at that time an actor such as Boris Karloff, with his physical features, could effectively become a superstar of that time. And of course, all these films, from Frankenstein's monster to The Mummy to Dracula, all for the first time to much wider mainstream audiences, are introducing these classic monsters that you couldn't even imagine an independent filmmaker approaching very easily now. Sure, there are plenty of vampiric in indie horror films one might do, and zombies, but The Mummy, Dracula, remarkable. But of course, back then, this was all fresh. Babette remarks that Wales' infusion of humour was brilliant. This is in respects to the old Dark House. His films hold up for modern audiences in a way his genre contemporaries often do not. And I agree. And it would be interesting to consider what personal quality of the director James Whale makes that especially so. One might remark and consider that James Whale's personal life and the struggles he endured at times with his personal life in regards to his sexual orientation made him especially modern and cosmopolitan in some respects in his thinking and ideas and approaches in comparison to his peers. His tolerances and ideas were perhaps, or probably were, ahead of the time, especially in comparison to his more conservative peers. And his affection for those considered outcasts and oddballs may well have allowed him to give them a more authentic and compassionate representation as well, that again placed such stories and characters ahead of their time. That's just an idea. It's not certainly not a fact. Brooke H says, funny enough, one of my favourite films from that era wasn't American, it was German, the film M. So we're in the 1930s now, and we can go to M. So you might be wondering, some of you, what is the film M? M, 1931, is directed by Fritz Lang, legendary German director. And it stars Peter Lorre, the great character actor with a very distinctive face, playing effectively a paedophile serial killer who is stalking the streets of Berlin at night and luring and kidnapping children, only for them to be discovered dead. And it sends the city into a panic. And in the film we follow a police investigation which begins to unravel, not the perpetrator of the crime, but rather unravel in terms of efficiency. In some ways a metaphor for the perceptions of the failed state or the failing bureaucracy of the German state at the time. Who comes to the rescue is not the police, but in fact the criminal underground as well, who lead their own manhunt and eventually create an almost match replica of society, from investigation, arrest, and even trial as well. There is some very interesting, though, moral dilemmas that are unexpectedly introduced by Peter Lorre's character at the end of the film, which throw the entire moral perspective of this terrible criminal and crimes he's done into a challenging perspective for the audience. Kind of Brechtian, it almost invites the audience into a very uncomfortable place, before making their final emotional decision on what the fate of his character should be. So M is a classic, and it's not really a horror film per se, but it is truly a horrific film, and one I'd certainly consider to be kind of a masterpiece. Babette also says about James Whale, James Wales had also served in the war, which gave him an understanding of gallows humour as a release from horror. He employed that sensibility to the screen. Absolutely, ask any doctor or medical student as well, and their sense of humour, especially dark, is one that helps them to get through traumas and challenges that those of us who do not have to do such jobs would otherwise find impossible. Phil Chadwick says he loves Laurie. I know him best from noir films. I've not seen M. Well, in that case, you are in for an absolute treat, Phil, because in many respects, M is a little bit like the Apocalypse Now of Peter Lorre films. I use my Apocalypse Now as a kind of reference for anything that is just astonishingly awesome when it concerns Peter Lorre. Sorry, when it concerns a film that is just exceptional among its peers, like the ultimate. So let's have a look. Where are we now? So we've gone past, right, yeah, let's talk about White Zombie, 1932. We have Boris Karloff as well in White Zombie, I think. Am I right? No, I'm not. Am I? It's Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi. Okay, I'm wrong. It's just Bela Lugosi, White Zombie being a film that I haven't actually seen, unfortunately, which is a bit of a confession because it is a very famous horror film in its own right. Have any of you seen White Zombie? And do you have any remarks to make about that? Of course you won't. None of you will have seen White Zombie. I'm in the clear. Incidentally, White Zombie wasn't Universal Picture, was an independent film as well. Was it made at a time when Bela Lugosi's career was already stuttering? Surely not. In 1934, we have The Black Cat with Boris, where Brooke says, "We're in good company not having seen it with you." Good. Well, it is in public domain, so we might be able to have a screening party one day and have you all hang out with me as we watch it. I don't know if that's allowed, but that would be good. Ah, okay, Babette tells us. White Zombie is a film that uses voodoo ideas to tell the story of mesmerism. Mesmerism is a fascinating thing, of course. Mesmerism being associated with Franz Mesmer, who perhaps developed the early forerunner to hypnotism. Mesmerism is a theme that we see as well in films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and it was a fascinating aspect. So perhaps Babette can tell us then if the White Zombie utilizes voodoo then as a supernatural explanation for the behavior of mesmerism, or whether it is employed more cynically, like there's like a mad scientist's technique and voodoo is a sham to hide that control. Ah, okay, right. So the zombies are true voodoo zombies rather than George Romero zombies. And thank you, Babette. Brooke, meanwhile, says, The Black Cat I definitely remember. Enjoyed it, even if it had nothing to do with Poe's original story. Yes, and like with the Murders of the Rue Morgue, Brooke, this is a surprisingly common theme that we start to see with Edgar Allan Poe adaptations. So, The Black Cat of 1934 most famously combines Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi, two of the great superheroes of horror casting at the time, in the same film. Some consider it to have helped develop the psychological horror subgenre, with its emphasis on atmosphere, eerie sounds, and darker sides of the human psyche. Again, remember this is from our limited American, European-centric perspective. Of course, there are films doing this in other parts of the world, like A Page of Madness from Japan 15 years before. The film was made at a time that was exploiting a very sudden interest in psychiatry as well. This, as a relatively new science compared to psychology, I think played a role in the growth of many films around that time and just before that looked at the subject of mind control in various ways. We have some other comments here. Phil Chadwick says the oldest zombie film he's seen is The Ghostbreakers, which is his favourite film of that period. Phil, I've not heard of The Ghostbreakers, so if you can let us know what year it was made and who directed it and why it's your favourite, I would be fascinated to know, and then we can discuss that. Babette says it's a Svengali-like story that appropriates voodoo as a means to Bella's mesmerism. Interesting, Babette. Well, interesting to watch then. There is another character from German expressionist horror films that utilises mesmerism to great effect. I think directed by F.W. Murnau, but I can't remember what it is. But there were 2 films made, and the star was a supervillain of sorts, a kind of evil genius. You might be the one to know who that was. Brooke says, this was the height of Freudian psychoanalysis, so there's a lot of horror films drawn from it. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yep, just and the use of psychiatric drugs and experimentation, absolutely. So these are themes which films of the time were exploring because this was part of the pop culture. In 1935, we have 4 horror films released by Universal Pictures. The Mystery of Edwin Druid, and this is a story about an opium-addicted choirmaster who develops an obsession for a beautiful young girl and will stop at nothing, short of murder to have her. Based on a Charles Dickens novel. But more famously, Bride of Frankenstein premieres in 1935, which has the very, very beautiful Elsa Lanchester, actress, in her very distinctive hair for the role, play the Bride of Frankenstein as well. And many consider it, it might sound like hyperbole to say, one of the greatest sequels. Many considering it potentially even better than the very first film. This too was directed by James Whale and also stars Boris Karloff as the monster. It's really quite something as well to think who came up with and it could be a story in itself, who came up with the distinctive look for Elsa Lanchester's hair as well, which is remarkable with its lightning bolt sides, After Bride of Frankenstein, Universal Pictures premieres Werewolf of London, the first mainstream horror movie to feature a werewolf, which of course as a creature of folklore had existed for several hundred years, I would assume, in Europe and perhaps in different forms in Native American culture as well. So we have, let's see, what was it called? Werewolf of London, right, 1935. And then 6 years later, we would get a second werewolf film, the Wolfman, which is perhaps the werewolf film most of us recognise as being the earliest, or one of the earliest. I hadn't actually heard of Werewolf of London from 1935, directed by Stuart Walker. But the Wolfman, yeah, well, we all know the Wolfman. Phil Chadwick says, The Ghostbreakers is a 1940 American mystery horror film directed by George Marshall, starring Bob Hope, of all people, and Paulette Goddard. I'm a big fan of Bob and Godard, and the mix of humour and scares is something I love, like Ghostbusters. Phil, absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's the exact reason I like The Old Dark House as well. We all love our horror films, but if you get a unique blend of comedy and horror, then it is one of the sweetest indulgences one can have with their love of the genre. And Bob Hope, of course, was a master craftsman when it came to comedy, performance, charm, and charisma. So of course, I imagine he would only enhance any film he was in. And Phil also remarks that he likes The Cat and the Canary, a film we mentioned earlier. Another Cat and the Canary, should I say, to the one I mentioned earlier. Sorry, a subsequent Cat and the Canary, which also starred Bob Hope and Paulette Goddard. Babette remarks, as a side note, that modern audiences are often gobsmacked by pre-code horror films. They surprise people with their boldness. And the code that Babette refers to is the Hays Code, which placed limitations on the depictions of sexuality, violence, and all sorts of things, really, which were at the time hilariously satirized by a photograph, I think published in New York Magazine, or the New Yorker, should I say. I might be wrong, but them has a photograph that demonstrates a break of every single code element. They would include things such as a woman displaying any aspect of her underwear or lingerie or stockings, a policeman having been a victim of anything, things like that. Brooke says that he thought The Bride of Frankenstein was better than the original, but he can't say the same for Dracula's daughter. And yeah, absolutely, many people believe and feel that The Bride of Frankenstein was superior, and to be honest, I would be in agreement on that point. So we can continue our moving on. In 1935, Universal Pictures again put Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff together for another Edgar Allan Poe film, The Raven. Now, I am interested in what you guys think of this, because the 1935 The Raven is, to me, a slightly strange beast. What do you think? Did you like it? Did you not? On a much camper note, I always had a very big soft spot for The Raven that starred Vincent Price and Boris Karloff, produced, many years later. And perhaps my affection for the latter comedy horror places its forebear in an unfair territory. But if you have any comments about the 1935 The Raven, I would be delighted to hear them. Phil Chadwick remarks that with the Hays Code twin beds, always confused him that they weren't allowed to have a double, which was one of the silly things back then. And Brooke is no fan of 1935 The Raven either. Of course, if you are a fan of 1935 The Raven, nothing wrong with that, and you can let us know what you like about it. So, the problem was that the horror genre itself, though, was starting to kind of struggle a little bit. And some of the themes for The Raven led to a temporary ban in England, which was an important distribution market at the time. And this had a particularly devastating effect on the career of Bela Lugosi as well, who at the time was struggling to support himself and his family. And this had to be like salt in the wound. Phil Chadwick says, like myself, he enjoyed the Vincent Price one. Of course, it is a very different film than the 1935 version of The Raven. And Babette critiques the 1935 Raven with the following. He says he's not really quite sure what sort of film it wanted to be. Seeing a young Jack Nicholson in a film with the huge stars of the previous generation's horror is interesting. Yes, absolutely. Dracula's Daughter in 1936. Universal Pictures was continuing to produce more films in its series. And it also premiered The Invisible Ray as well. Again, pitting Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff together. So we're kind of seeing aspects of horror and science fiction now coming in for the first time as well. Dracula's Daughter, which stars Gloria Holden, didn't feature Bela Lugosi or his character, but instead tells the story of his daughter. Now, funny enough, Dracula's Daughter is a very divisive film. People have very strong opinions about whether or not it's good. Some appreciate the kind of the performance of Gloria Holden, the kind of tongue-in-cheek nature, and at times consider it to be quite creepy. The writer Anne Rice of The Interview with Vampire horror novel fame considered that particular film to be a direct inspiration for her own homoerotic vampire fiction, to quote her in her own words as well. Some have even considered that the film might have had some inspiration for Sunset Boulevard, which is perhaps a very, very bold claim, directed by Billy Wilder. Sunset Boulevard, in fact, being one of my favourite films. Brooke says, in criticism of Universal Studios, that it did pull poorly, as in it didn't do very good adaptations of the works of Edgar Allan Poe. Price's adaptations were so much better. So, of course, Roger Corman. And Roger Corman is a friend of ours and a supporter of Hex Studios as well, a patron of our studio. So he is like our granddad, Uncle Corman. Yeah, his adaptations of Poe, I felt, had a wonderfully authentic spirit to them. And many of them form the top 10 of my own horror film favourites, including The Fall of the House of Usher, which I've always adored, absolutely adored. But I think Vincent Price is magnificent in that. The scene in the crypt when our poor hero, having just buried his fiancée, remarks to Vincent Price, "Is there no end to your terror?" Vincent Price turns and goes, "None whatsoever." It's just remarkable. And of course, The Mask of the Red Death as well, which, with its dark dialogue and foreboding and strange atmosphere, I think is a remarkable film. Brooke says he can even see comparisons with the Price era Poe in our own works, especially The Black Gloves. Absolutely. And also Brooke, The Devil's Machine / Automata, and many of the dream scenes in general are also inspired by the very ubiquitous dream scenes of Roger Corman employed in his Poe adaptations as well. Yes, Babette also recommends The Haunted Palace, Vincent Price film, very Lovecraftian film, he says. which I agree with. Babette also talks about Dracula's daughter. He says it contains some very overt notes of lesbianism on screen, which was shocking for that type. The prototype established gave us Morticia, Vampira, and Elvira. Babette, I would agree with that. I think that's a fair perspective. Dracula's daughter's delivery of her lines moves the film into camp, but is fun, and I think that's an affectionate perspective to give it. I think that's justified. But of course, there are folks that find that to be irritating or alienating to what they wanted, which was atmosphere, horror, and less of a meta perspective on those other themes that you've identified. So their Dracula trilogy effectively ended from Dracula, Dracula's daughter, to Son of Dracula. We're kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but we'll do it briefly to 1943. Son of Dracula, directed by Robert Siodmak. I have not seen it, to be fair. If I was to look at the contemporary reviews, Hollywood Reporter declared that a top-line entry as a horror film, well-made, intelligent decision by Robert Siodmak, and that Chaney's Dracula, this is Lon Chaney Jr., not Lon Chaney Sr., that I was complimenting earlier. Yeah, by all means, seemed to be quite solid. Have any of you seen Son of Dracula from 1943? Please let me know in the comments below. So we're now moving towards the end of the 1930s, and we're approaching ever closer to the commencement of the Second World War in 1939. I think many would consider 1936, 37, 38, 39 as marking a slow decline for Universal Pictures. So we have films such as Night Key, which is a kind of crime thriller with Boris Karloff. Not ostensibly a horror film per se. The 1938 Universal shied away from producing more horror films, instead concentrating their efforts on re-releases of their previous films, and a 12-part series called The Phantom Creeps, which starred Bela Lugosi as a mad scientist who attempts to rule the world with crazy inventions. Finally, in 1939, we get Son of Frankenstein, which is the third Frankenstein film. So they're now completing a trilogy for Frankenstein, as well as having done so for Dracula. Well, it would do 3 years later. So in The Son of Frankenstein, we have Boris Karloff as the monster, and Bela Lugosi as Igor. The film is a sequel to James Whale's Bride of Frankenstein, which was considered a masterpiece, and it starred Basil Rathbone. Now, Basil Rathbone, if any of you ever read the books Hollywood Babylon, which were wonderful tabloid-esque paperbacks, which talked a lot about the sex scandals of the Hollywood era in the 20s and 30s, which would appall some, but make others, such as myself, a little envious. But never mind. Basil Rathbone was quite the character at the cocktail parties. Let's just leave it at that. Also, we have Tower of London, which is also starred Basil Rathbone as well, and Boris Karloff as well, and Vincent Price as well as a small part in that film. So, also Lionel Atwill, should I say, is also in Son of Frankenstein as well. Basil Rathbone and Lionel Atwill, great actors in their day. So, oh yeah, I couldn't recommend those books enough, Phil. Phil's just thanks to recommendations. They're good fun. So we have some wonderful opinions here. Brooke says the Son of Dracula was very decent. Average popcorn viewing, but decent. Enjoyable without being much of anything innovative or memorable. Yeah. Phil Chadwick's, yep, again, remarks about the books I recommended. That's Hollywood Babylon, which is great fun. And Brooke also says, Son of Frankenstein was quite good, really good acting, but I don't think Whale did that one, so it wasn't quite as good as the others. And that's correct. Son of Frankenstein was directed by Roland V. Lee. I am not especially familiar with him, but he did a whole variety of films from the 1920s all the way. He did, for example, The Mysterious Dr. Fu Manchu in 1929, uncredited though. And he kept working until the late 1950s. He did quite a lot of Fu Manchu films as producers as well. We did Cardinal Richelieu in 1935 and The Three Musketeers in 1935, starring Walter Abel. I thought for a second it was Douglas Fairbanks Jr. for a second, but no. So yeah, maybe, again, forgive me if I'm wrong, chaps, but maybe a smaller time director for the third Frankenstein film. And maybe this was because Universal was, getting a little bit tighter in the pockets as it was beginning to struggle. Tower of London is a different fish, of course. We have Basil Rathbone playing King Richard III. I can't say any details about this, but there's a friend of mine, an independent filmmaker, producing a film right now that may well be a remake of something like this, so that could be exciting. But yeah, a great film. What do you guys think of Tower of London? Do you have an affection for it, or are you not too happy about that one? Is Vincent Price's smaller role in Tower of London enough to turn that film around into something spectacular? Maybe not. No need, Brooke. Don't hang your head in shame for having not seen it. Yeah, because you've seen my films, which is actually much more important when you think about it. So, Neil Fraser says hello. Hello, Neil. It's an absolute pleasure to see you here. And he apologises for missing the start. It's looking good. Some fascinating knowledge you're giving us today. Well, I'm doing my best, but it's a collaboration. We're discussing, after all, the adventures in the history of horror. And right now, folks, we are at 1940, pretty much. So we still have a bit to go. And Neil, I look forward to joining the discussion. Iris30 welcome as well. Iris says they have not seen Tower of London either, but Vincent Price is always worth watching, and I couldn't agree more. I was just complimenting Vincent Price as the star of two of my favourite horror films, and that is The Fall of the House of Usher and The Mask of the Red Death. Phil Chadwick complains that Tower of London 1939 doesn't even have a wiki plot that needs filling in. We will all be too lazy to do that, but we will remember always the need for there to be a wiki plot for that particular film. So, Universal is in the lead, but it's starting to struggle by 1939. But we do have other studios as well. MGM had released the very controversial Freaks, directed by Todd Burning in 1932, utilising characters with real deformities. The studio even disavowed any connection with the film, and it remained banned in in Britain for almost 50 years. We had remarked earlier about the transformation scene in Dr. Jekyll Mr Hyde. That was the 1931 film by Paramount, which was innovative for its use of photographic filters, blue, white, and red, which helped to change the contrast on someone's face, even though it was filmed in black and white, to create this amazing transformation look. Also, RKO had released King Kong in 1933. As well, we can't forget our monster movies. In other parts of the world, Danish directors such as Carl Theodor Dreyer had created the horror fantasy film Vampire, 1932, and you know what, again, we said it earlier today, folks, but there'll be a whole pile of films produced in Japan as well around that time, and the rest of the world, but we can only see so much or discuss so much. So our perspective remains mostly on Europe and the United States. Phil remarks as an interesting aside that Basil Rathbone also plays a role in the Tower of London 1962 version as well, which is an interesting thing. It must have been quite fun as well from a casting perspective to be in that remake. So now we're in the 1940s and everything's changing. Of course, during the course of the Second World War, over 100 million people would die, and its influences and impact on art, culture, on humanity itself would forever change the perspective on horror. You know, people coming back from those experiences and conflicts expected something different from their experience of so-called horror. And I guess, more or less, they were going to begin getting it, you know? So, you got the success of the Wolfman in the 1940s, great. You know, but the problem for Universal was that people were starting to get a little tired of the shtick. They'd had it since 1930, 10 years of monster movies. Funnily enough, it doesn't seem to have affected the superhero genre, has it? We're going to see these bastards in leotards for the last 30 years, and we're going to get them again for another 30 years. Ugh. We'll probably need 30 Wikipedias to track the slow decline of the superhero genre. Because it'll be like about 15 millennia before that dies out. Never mind. I do digress, don't I? So after 10 years, folks are getting impatient with Universal's monster movie formula. You know, eventually, as you will recall, we start to get comedic parodies of those films. Abbott and Costello, Meet Frankenstein being one good example. And these were fun, you know, I guess the equivalents of Scary Movie in their day. It's not to say that Universal wasn't releasing a pile of horror movies. Many of them were sequels, reboots, and such like. But each one was just aiming a little lower every time and delivering less and less. In 1940, Universal released 3 movies. We have The Invisible Man Returns, which stars Vincent Price. I think most of us have a soft spot for that one in some way or other. If I'm wrong, tell me. We have The Mummy's Hand as well, and some claim it to be a kind of unofficial sequel to The Mummy from 1932. Though it's only tenuously connected, I think, story-wise. Other sequels featuring the mummy known as Caris include The Mummy's Tomb, The Mummy's Ghost, and The Mummy's Curse, 1944. Tom Tyler played the Mummy in many of those films, but Lon Chaney Jr. would take over because, after all, he was a name. You know, his father was big. Book remarks The Invisible Man Returns was good, but accidentally refers to it as The Invisible Hand, which is a very different film released by Vivid Entertainment in 2014, and you don't want to watch that one with your mother-in-law in the background. So in the December of 1944, we have, no, that's not 1944. Just check my notes here. Was it 1942? Apologies, my notes are wrong for this. But we have The Invisible Woman, which was the third film in the Invisible Man series, if I recall. And that would have been 1940. And again, mad scientists, this time working for the Third Reich, as these films were produced during wartime. We also have The Ghost of Frankenstein, Son of Dracula, and The She-Wolf of London in 1946, which starred June Lockhart as well, who was very, very pretty and talented. So, we have some other comments here. Phil loved the Abbott and Costello film horror mix. They were very clever, and they were. It's very easy to kind of poo-poo those films, but they were great comedians, and it was perfect timing for that, because it was at a time when horror was just needing to evolve a little bit, and that's where satirists and comedians can help art move along a little bit. Craig Seath, who is one of our Hex family, who works on our films as well, remarks, the one that freaked me out the most was when he was young was The Tingler with Vincent Price. And Craig, being an older gentleman, what freaked him out the most was having to do the catering on The Tingler, as Vincent Price had very specific tastes. Babette remarks that the fear of the atom age and communism altered the face of the entire genre. Absolutely, it's quite right. By the time we get to 1945, the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the effects of radiation poisoning and fire and everything like that forever changed the idea of horror. What could kill you, which was invisible, was no longer a ghost or a demon or anything like that, or supernatural. There was now a new scientific enemy that mimicked many of our greatest fears about the unknown. And right enough, this would begin to influence horror in the form of early horror science fiction. Ira says, remarks about the She-Wolf of London. About the expression wolfsbane passing into pop culture and folklore as a result of that film. Says story. Book H also recommends The Black Cat as another good horror comedy. Craig Seath appreciates my earlier joke. And Mechas Mate, hello there. Mexi Mate and greetings. Babette Bombshell says, William Castle invented modern film marketing. He was a genius of marketing. Yeah, absolutely. I think many would feel that way about him. Absolutely. But if you have a specific example and film that you feel characterizes that genius of William Castle and his marketing, feel free to share that and your reasoning as well. So, let's see. 1941, Universal Pictures, still dominating the field of horror, releases a reboot, should I say, to Werewolf of London, starring Henry Hull, in The Wolfman, 1941. And, well, we all know The Wolfman. Now, here's a question. do you love The Wolfman of 1941? It's one of these films that, for example, many directors from, for example, honestly, I must be becoming an old man, from Joe Dante to directors such as John Landis as well, that have very particular appreciations of The Wolfman in 1941. It meant a lot to them, you know, and it meant a lot to the generation that grew up watching that film. It even has special meaning, I think, if I'm correct, for author Stephen King as well, who featured that particular monster incarnation as a form of Pennywise the Clown in It as well. But I would love to know what you guys think of The Wolfman, and if you like it. Brooke says he absolutely does. It's not a perfect film, but it holds a special place in his heart for its performances, its effects, etc. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I think one of the big problems we have in modern horror at the moment is that, and this is not you guys are great, but for many horror fans, they are so particular about effects and whatnot, to the point now where it's like, it's harder to relate to horror fans who don't have the same soft spot for things that aren't perfect in horror films. You know, for example, when folks watch The Evil Dead for the first time, it's terrifying, it's amazing, it's a brilliant movie, in my opinion. But it's of course not a perfect showcase of practical effects, cinematography, or anything like that. It's almost like there are some fans nowadays that look at new horror films as if they're like video games. You know, the graphics aren't good enough. You know what I mean? I don't know. Babette expands on his remarks about William Castle inventing modern film marketing being a genius. And this was in relation to our fears about the atomic age, which affected audiences and changing tastes as they were in the mid-1940s. Castle spent money on marketing in ways the major studios didn't, wiring seats to buzz during The Tingler, having skeletons float over the audience in 13 Ghosts. He made films events. Absolutely. And yeah, that's the perfect example. And yeah, there was maybe one or two that burned their fingers on The Tingler, but it was a genius move. Okay, in the 1940s, we have Val Lewton, you know, from Luton's Bus. Can anyone tell me what Luton's Bus is again? I'm sure there's someone. Come on. So Val Lewton, RKO Films, director of Cat People, brilliant. You know, absolutely great noir thriller. And I Walked with a Zombie as well. I don't want to take away the pleasure of someone explaining Luton's Bus. I Walked with a Zombie was directed by Jacques Tourney, but produced by Val Lewton, just to make that point. And so was Cat People as well. But so distinctive is Val Lewton's influence that many do mistakenly credit him as director for the films. A bit like Steven Spielberg with Poltergeist. Brooke remarks on my complaining about some modern horror fans. Oops. Don't dislike me, please. Too many modern horror fans want gory, precise practical effects and jump scares over chilling performances, thrilling cinematography, and terrifying lighting. And Brooke also adds that Cat People is one of his favourite top horror films of all time. And yeah, great. I think one of the things I've noticed in many horror Facebook groups, which I enjoy, I'm a part of the horror community, but there are many that indulge and really enjoy looking at images and videos of real murders, deaths, and accidents, you know, things like that. And don't get me wrong, I certainly have no critique to make of morbid curiosity. That is an aspect of us all. You know, it's not to critique that. But there are some that almost complain that horror fails to meet the standard of real life horror, which to me is a misunderstanding of the role of artists, which is not that of documentarian, and certainly not to mimic what is now tragically readily available because it's readily common, which is the recorded acts of man's inhumanity to man, woman, and child, and so forth. And yes, Babette remarks about Luton's bus. He invented the jump scare, and absolutely, in Cat People, there is the Luton bus is when a jump scare occurs where one doesn't expect it to. So, in an example, it might be when someone gets off the phone, walks across the street, pauses, and it's quiet, and they're about to cross when suddenly a car, or in the case of Luton's bus, a bus passes by quite suddenly with a loud noise, and they jump back. You know, it's a simple technique, but it's one that has become famous throughout horror films and thrillers, and is most often affectionately referred to as the Luton bus. Brooke remarks that our own films had some terrifying effects, such as The Encounters of Ravens. And it's all about the application of those moments. And yes, absolutely. And for me, the best application for those moments is for dramatic effect. You know, they should have something to say about the story and the character's state of mind. But if they're only there for titillation, then that's not useful for my type of storytelling. But that's not to say it's bad for other types of entertainment. For example, Peter Jackson's Brain Dead, or Dead or Alive, I think it's called in the US, zombie comedy film is especially gratuitous, but is for, you know, for effect that is compatible with its story and aesthetic and style. Whereas, for example, a serious horror film that had a very dramatic storyline that felt emotional, if it were to indulge in gratuitous gore like Dead or Alive does for comedic or stylistic effect, might not be as effective. It's interesting. It's all a matter of taste, of course. Yes, Iris 30 follows up on my points earlier about real gore and the attitudes of some horror fans who entertain themselves with real life gore and complain that about horror films which are not gory enough. Brooke confirms Dead Alive is the name of Brain Dead, the Peter Jackson zombie movie in the US. Phil Chadwick makes a curious point that he thinks social media, smartphones, and blue lights, and God knows what, the algorithms, the software, the way it plays with our hormones, you know, updates and all that, have overall acted in such a manner as to distract audiences and make them more less inclined to be relaxed or to have patience watching some films and things like that. That could, to some, sound like a lazy perspective, an argument, but I think it does actually have some credence, I would say, because I know certainly social media and the way that we engage with media now has changed dramatically, and it can only make people less patient, especially young folks who have been brought up from it from the start. But you know, at the same time, as artists, our jobs are to challenge the experience, because it's not always a pleasant experience with social media. The constant clicking, the constant need for validation, affirmation, and all these weird, strange things can be exhausting and traumatizing and emotionally disturbing for folks of all ages, but especially young folks. To understand that there is an art form and a way of life that can step back, and that you can look to the past as well for examples where that neurosis wasn't constantly present, then it might in some ways be liberating for them. And Phil continues to elaborate on those points as well, citing those who use smartphones in cinemas, which at the moment is actually a rare occurrence in the UK, but is, in my experiences in the US, very common, very different traditions for viewing films. Brooke now says he has to go, but asks and hopes that there could be a Hex convention, which, you know, we do look forward to being able to do Hex events in future as well. I think that would be fantastic. And thank you, Brooke, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Babette also remarks that MTV video editing, music videos and all that has had its own impact. And yes, absolutely. The evolution of social media and its media has come at the tail end of a slow change that has speeded up dramatically in the last 30, 40 years. So we'll continue on, folks, and we'll continue on till 1950, because I think we'll stop at 1950 and then we'll make this part one. I'll change the image thumbnail so everyone else can know that they're coming into another period. So we're in the 1940s at the moment. We have the Leopard Man, 1943. I have not seen the Leopard Man. Again, Jacques Tourneur, produced by Val Luton. Its release at the time in 1943 was mixed, and was described by the New York Times as half-baked, and the Leopard Man is nothing but a feeble and obvious attempt to frighten and shock the audience with a few exercises in mayhem. I mean, that's a fairly lazy critique, though, that could be applied to many, to every horror film. But what do you think of the Leopard Man? And also, thank you all for your comments about wishing to attend a future Hex Con. Absolutely. Our hope is to build our community here at Channel Hex, and any suggestions or assistance with that, along with our Facebook group for Channel Hex, we hope can provide the foundation for a transformative force in the horror genre that can champion and celebrate traditional storytelling and events as well, like festivals, conventions. It's about working together, really, because I've realized more and more as I work in the industry that these things cannot be done by one company or one person alone, that we almost have to carve out our own piece of art and culture if we want something to preserve and something to cherish that isn't fucked about with, as you know, without a care to the whims of, you know, forever changing pop culture. Yeah, in other words, there are some beautiful things in the genre that have to be cherished and preserved, with art that celebrates the best of the past, or at least attempts to. Because I'm certainly not so presumptuous to assume that my films do that. So we have a whole pile of RKO films directed by Jacques Tourneur, or Turner, a person who really doesn't quite get enough credit compared to compared to Val Luton. We also have The Body Snatcher. Now, this is an interesting film, and I would very much like to hear what you think about The Body Snatcher. Robert Wise is the director of the Body Snatcher, famous for a whole pile of films and work that he did. For example, everything from Born to Kill 1947, to The Haunting, most especially in 1963. And something I didn't realise was that he was also the editor for Citizen Kane, directed by, of course, Orson Welles. So, The Body Snatcher was one of 3 films that Boris Karloff did with RKO that were produced by Val Lewton. The other 2 were Isle of the Dead, 1945, and Bedlam in 1946. Karloff had left Universal Pictures and was working with Lewton. Although he had achieved stardom with Universal, the declining fortunes of those Gothic adaptations had really forced him to look for new options. And Val Lewton and his kind of more fantastical contemporary set films offered, a way out. He even is quoted as saying that Lewton was the man who rescued him from the living dead and restored, so to speak, his soul, which is, high praise. What do you guys think of The Body Snatcher? Of course, also set in Edinburgh, a town very close to my heart, or our capital, in fact, and close by to where I live. The Body Snatcher, incidentally, is also a film selected by the National Film Registry in the US for preservation as a culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant work of art. Embarrassingly, the National Film Registry hasn't yet called me for any of my student short films, which it cited as culturally, historically, or aesthetically insignificant, unfortunately. So I'm working to change that. Also, for RKO, for Universal, should I say, Lon Chaney Jr., in his father's footsteps, had become the studio's leading monster movie actor. Paramount was also releasing horror films in the 1940s, and its biggest hit is a film I adore. I think it's fantastic, and I hope you all like it as well. And it's The Uninvited, 1944, The Uninvited, directed by Lewis Allen, with Ray Milland and Ruth Hussey. Really great, creepy, almost kind of almost kind of M.R. James-esque for an American horror film, at least. Phil Chadwick says, I can't think of Karloff without hearing Martin Landau as Bela Lugosi shouting, "That limey cocksucker." Which, yeah, Martin Landau did an incredible performance as Bela Lugosi in the film Ed Wood, directed by Tim Burton. So, The Uninvited, 1944. I'm sure you all love that film. It's all right up there. And interestingly noted by some contemporary film critics as one of the first films to portray ghosts as real entities rather than as misunderstandings played for comedy. That it depicted a literal supernatural phenomenon. MGM also released in 1945 the picture of Dorian Gray, which, to be honest, I haven't seen. It has, of course, Angela Lansbury and Peter Lawford in it. 1941, MGM releases its own version of Dr. Jekyll and Hyde, starring Spencer Tracy, which I think Phil had mentioned earlier in our chat. And then in 1945 in Britain, we come to an absolutely remarkable film. In fact, IRES 30, you've just beaten me to it, haven't you? Dead of Night. In my mind, Dead of Night is a masterpiece. It is a horror film that popularized the anthology. It's a five story anthology with an incredible wraparound, which I think stands to the test of time as perhaps the best wraparound narrative for any anthology film so far. It was an inspiration for For We Are Many, but For We Are Many, that from Hex, is, and no offense to my own efforts or the filmmakers, but obviously it doesn't even remotely hold a candle to Dead of Night. But in technical form, For We Are Many takes more inspiration from modern takes on the anthology format, such as ABCs of Death and stuff. But Dead of Night, that's where our heart is, and we look forward to eventually being able to produce films like that. Or like those popularized by Amicus as well, as you will recall from the 1960s and 70s. But yes, Dead of Night, incredible. It features perhaps the first, if not the most terrifying, ventriloquist dummy ever seen in a horror film. So, it's incredible. Its story segment with the mirror is most probably an inspiration for Oculus as well, though one might dispute this quite acceptably. Dead of Night is excellent, and it really, I think, put Britain on the cultural map with horror in the 1940s. We have some comments here as well. Phil Chadwick remarks that they also love Dead of Night, and Jessica Fletcher in an early role. Oh, no, sorry, not Dead of Night. But the other one. Yes. And Dorian Gray, sorry, being the film. Phil also remarks that Dorian Gray was black and white, but colour as well, and in parts. And Babette says they're an anthology addict. Love them. I do as well. Anthology horror films often offer independent filmmakers a chance as well to produce their first feature by working collectively to produce shorts. And oftentimes at horror film festivals, it is the short film showcase, which I find to be the most charming and endearing out of the whole projects, that are shown as well. So I've always got a soft spot for those. Okay, we find that during the 1940s, there is much more mixing and matching of the horror genre with other genres, with especially film noir. So we're starting to see mystery films and thrillers that have horror elements. Some of these are among my favorites, such as The Spiral Staircase and The Seventh Victim, two films which that are inspiring for The Black Gloves. We also have a very interesting film I've not seen. It's a horror fantasy film called The Queen of Spades, 1949. It's about an elderly countess that makes a bargain with the devil in exchange for a soul for the ability to always win at cards. Wes Anderson, of all people, considers it to be a favourite of his, and Martin Scorsese described it as one of the true classics of supernatural cinema. I have not seen The Queen of Spades, 1949, directed by Thorold Dickinson. Who I've only heard of from their directing of Gaslight, though I'm not as familiar with their version in 1940. I'm more familiar with the I think with the latter production, I'm looking here, I'm like, yeah, there's a Gaslight with Angela Lansbury in it. That's the one I'm more familiar with. So anyway, Queen of Spades, what do you guys think? Have you heard of it? this is going on my viewing list. The New York Times noted it as a most beautifully accomplished cast, exquisite Baroque production and staging of a tense and startling sort. If it's romantic shivers you're wanting, this is undoubtedly your film. So, I will put that on my watch list. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our 1940s peekaboo. Of course, there are hundreds of horror films produced in the 1920s, 30s, 40s that we haven't had a chance to discuss. But of course, we shall eventually. I want to thank you all so much for watching and for supporting our channel, and I hope as well that you might share our link and let folks know about our discussion, because I think there's some fun things folks can draw from it. Also, we have our Kickstarter campaign, and I've just posted the link to that as well. I think you've all pledged already, but if you haven't, then even a single dollar helps our project. Folks, thank you so much for watching. I'm sure you're all subscribed, so I don't have to tell you that. And I look forward to another video which will look at horror films from the 1950s and onwards. So folks, until we meet again, I shall bid you all adieu.